This is Articulating,
an independent school podcast. Hi, welcome to part 2 of Articulating Podcasts, Equity and AI in Education series. Thank you so much for joining us once again. This is pre-recorded. However, Middle States Association is live in the comments to answer any AI questions that you have. My name is Sam Osborne. I am the executive producer for Articulating, as well as the co-host alongside my dear friend, Gina Parker Collins, who is the founder of RISE, Resources in Independent School Education. Want to shout out Amber Berry, our special guest today. Amber is the Vice President of AI and Strategy for Middle States Association. Thank you so much, Amber. Thank you as well to MSA President Christian Talbot and Morgan Mifflin, who is MSA's AI Project Manager. Like I said, this is part 2, and we are focused exclusively on students and how they can leverage AI for academic and social success. And then next week, we have a really fun episode, which is all about parents and how they can use AI for admissions, for managing their students' busy calendars, and how they can use it for personal use. So really fun series. Share it with family, share it with friends, share it with your school community. Thank you. Enjoy.
So given the ongoing discussion of screen time and how detrimental it can be for overuse with our children, why is it important for students to develop some AI literacy and some of their own discretion? And like, my eyes are really hurting me, maybe this blue light is a little bit too intense. Like, how do we encourage our children to take responsibility for their own AI literacy?
I recommend to all families to consider a family technology agreement. And what I love about having these conversations with kids, it's very helpful when the school initiates this conversation. So you're not the family coming out of nowhere here. But when kids are given the opportunity to talk about it, they talk about the boundaries they wish their parents had around technology and tools. I think the cell phone should not be at the table for dad either, right? And so it is nice to talk about, what are our values and what feels like enough. And kids are able to get there. They're able to notice that, yeah, I agree. If my phone's out all the time and I never talk to you, that's too much. And so coming to a healthy place as a family that fits for right now, but it's an ongoing conversation because developmentally where your kid is this year is not where they are next year, and their interests and things might change as well. And so I appreciate when families are willing to have that conversation. Maybe it doesn't look like a signed contract that they, kind of revisit quarterly, but sometimes it does. It looks like an agreement that we're going to take care of ourselves and our relationships and not allow technology to take the place of that. And at the same time, why is it important for students to develop AI literacy? It's because we see that AI is going to be it's the next critical skill for 21st century skills that, we've been studying and preparing our students for. It's part of the portrait of a graduate. I don't believe schools are going to be responsibly graduating students into their next schools, into their next work lives without having an understanding of the tool and a grasp of how to leverage it to help. And I feel like it's going to be an ongoing conversation, particularly in American culture, about excess. We do excess in so many ways, and anything to excess is harmful. So I think that's just a conversation about growing up in this society that we need to talk about constantly.
Amber, you're making me think. We actually just had an episode recently about literacy in the digital age, and there are students that are being graduated that are unable to get through a book. And now you're talking about, these other things about, how digital may prevent students from graduating to and being ready for college, being ready for the workforce. So really, really glad to have this time with you, just so that, the purpose of this interview, this session, is we want students to feel empowered, and we want students to feel informed. We want students to be safe when using this. And I think one thing we're leaving out is we want students to succeed. And so, let's figure out how we can uh, have our students, navigate the digital world, navigate AI. Let's try to uncover ways that we are producing students that are at their academic best, performing at their academic best, and using AI in a way that's not detrimental to them. Do you have an idea of specific knowledge, guardrails that ensure that students are using AI effectively and safely?
I would say, first for students and families to turn to the school. And if there are already stated policies, start right there. And if there's not, there are many avenues toward finding out some best practices to get going. And, I talked about this a little bit when I was really framing the conversation for parents, that parents ultimately have the discretion on how they want to raise their kids. At the same time, there are some guidelines that companies themselves are saying ChatGPT is not for young children. It's, in some of these chatbots, these brand names, they've published things like 18, 13 with parental guidance. And in the same way that plenty of young kids have Instagram accounts, and those are not designed for young children either, parents are ultimately going to have to be informed, in tuned, understand, and sign off on this. But I want children to know that these products are not designed for you, and they have not been tested to be safe for you. And that's why the guidance exists in the first place. And it might change. They might have versions for students over time that are more and more safe. But the idea is that we want them to understand how to interact with them carefully and have a discerning eye to understand how to tell the difference between what is truth and what is not truth, and how to bring the critical thinking to it. And so I think really good guidance for a student is to share what they're exploring with a trusted adult, with your teacher, with your advisor, with your coach, with your parent, that person, your person, make sure that they know what you're doing and invite them in with you to, what do you think of this outcome? Or, this is what it said, and I don't know, what do I do next with this? Am I sure that this is something that I should trust or move forward with? So I would say working with an adult, there's lots of online resources for just training and getting an understanding, but start with the school and the school's policies and stay in compliance, of course, because you should, but also because that's an institution you trust and it's going to have guidelines to protect you.
So that's a really great point. I had not thought of, what's the equivalent of ChatGPT, which has been my thing lately for my sixth grader, right? Or
Mhm.
my fourth grader. So when we're talking about having the safety rails up, what age? Is there a specific age that you think should be the minimum age for a child, a young scholar, to be engaging with Gen AI?
I think it goes right back to parental guidance.
Yeah.
I'm willing to engage with ChatGPT with my 7-year-old. The device is literally in my hands, but I'm not
Right,
hiding from him that this exists, right? It's not some
right.
magic that he has to be shielded from. And so I would say when we think about chatbots, which is the most common way to think about generative AI, they're not for children. And so the four big ones that you hear the most, I would say, like Gemini is for 18 and older. Claude is for
Mm,
18 and older. Copilot, 18 and older. And if you're younger, they say with parent permission. And I don't know what younger means to them. And then ChatGPT, 18 and older, but 13 and up with parental permission. And so if those big four companies are saying that, I think we need to trust that it's really not a good plan to let a sixth grader log into ChatGPT alone. But what would it look like, because they're under 13, to use it with them, I think is a whole different conversation. And I hope that teachers are modeling this in the classroom of like, what does this mean? And let's be critical of it and let's understand what this tool is and what it does before they're 18, right? It's too late to just launch all these products at them when they're 18 and they don't even understand what's coming.
so
And then oh,
should
go ahead.
parents be blocking some of these sites
Yeah.
to get to, you know what I'm saying? Like, the access is just right there. It's a few keystrokes away. So I remember when, the internet was really just becoming big, and parents were supposed to define what it was that their child could actually log into. I mean, similar
Mhm.
to schools, like some schools you can't use YouTube, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
should we really be putting in some safety blocks?
That is such a philosophical decision, right? It goes right back
Yeah,
to how do you want to raise your kids?
yeah,
And
yeah.
if you feel comfortable saying there's certain things that just don't need to be a temptation for my child, it would make sense to go the route of blocking. And
Hmm.
other folks are of the philosophy of like, oh, it's out there and you could
Right.
access it. But we're going
Hmm.
to have a lot of conversations about what is and is not okay in our household.
That critical thinking again. Yeah.
And then how are you
Hmm.
able to oversee the process? Because it's foolish to just say, well, I told my kid it's a rule, so I'm pretty sure they're not on any of these platforms. In what way are you
Right.
monitoring their use? And
Right.
that's tricky. What if it's a school device? How do you stay tuned in to knowing whether or not they're accessing these and using these maybe when they are not in your direct presence? So
Hmm.
the whole blocking conversation is a philosophy piece. Some families turn off the Wi-Fi at a certain hour, right? There's no way my kid is up in the middle of the night on devices because I blocked it. Family devices are charged in a public place. There's a lot of different techniques for this. Having the conversation outright is critical. Even if you do block it, you still need to have the conversation.
Hmm.
And in some
Yeah.
ways, you're going to need some checks and balances because, in my experience as a school leader, kids figure out how to take down your block so
Oh,
easily.
They're
You're
like,
just
we
giving
know
them
your
motivation,
password.
they are
right?
The password is
smarter than a
1, 2, 3,
third
4.
grader.
Right? I think my mom used to take the controller to the video game system to work, right? Like that was the only way to prevent
Yeah.
someone from playing video games.
Oh,
So at this point, I don't know what tools you're going to use, but
Yeah.
being aware that it's a
Yeah.
conversation is important.
parents, take
Hmm.
the router with you to work.
Oh
That's
gosh.
just cruel.
But
That's no,
it's
no.
back to trust. It's back to
That's
trust, and you
trust.
only have trust when you're building relationships around something, right?
Totally.
Exactly.
I mean,
Yeah.
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
alternative scenario. I think we're going to talk a lot about worst case for this session,
Mhm.
but the best case is that your student masters AI and leverages it responsibly and everything.
Right.
What
Right.
are ways that parents can enable that and lay a foundation for that?
I am hearing anecdotally that parents who are super into Gen AI, like myself, are creating logins for their children and asking their kids to experiment freely. I'm hearing a lot about children's natural dispositions or lending themselves to Gen AI. And it reminds me a little bit about Apple products and how they were so intuitive, like a baby could swipe through photos and like get it. And there's something about generative AI that adults approach, they're pretty prescriptive. Like they feel like there must be some magic formula to doing it right. But it's really about thinking incredibly expansively and not like I have to do X to do Y to do Z that helps kids master it a lot faster, frankly, than adults. And so by
Hmm.
interacting together and a parent, maybe just kind of observing and not trying to give too many rules and regulations, but being there as a thought partner next to them would unlock a lot for the adult to learn a new way to interact with the tool, but also allow kids to start to experiment. And when the conversation goes sideways or this isn't really working out, this isn't where we wanted to go with this, the parent is there to support. And so I feel like that super that practice of having your child do their homework in the kitchen with their device turned toward you, right, as opposed to alone in their room, is just it's a different kind of philosophy of like how do we do this together, co-construction instead of trying
Hmm.
to hide and really regularly sharing. I can't wait to the point that I'm sharing things with my kids about like what I'm doing with work that they can really grasp. Right now it's pretty basic and elementary, but I know over time they'll be intrigued by what I'm doing and I'm going to learn a lot from what they're
Hmm.
doing too.
I
Yeah.
definitely think that, having been in the corporate, I mean, any sector, public, private, what have you, being on the right side of AI and learning how to leverage it is going to be a game changer professionally. I mean, I think the ways that I use it, I think there's a lot of people in white collar corporate roles that should be like quaking in their boots and so the sooner you can like master that and
Yeah.
learn how to leverage that for academic and professional success, the better.
You make me think of
Yeah.
two things there in that statement. And one is it's back to Ethan Mollick out of UPenn and the business school, who says he doesn't believe that AI is going to replace people. You know, teachers are worried about job security and folks are worried that jobs will be replaced right away. It's less that AI is going to replace jobs and more that the folks who learn how to use AI effectively are going to be the most competitive out there, the most competitive students, the most competitive parents, right? And it's not that competition is the end all, but if we're talking about giving our kids an edge, you know, we choose independent schools for a reason. We choose this development, this values-based driven preparation for the future for a reason. And so if generative AI is yet another thing that needs to be mastered and harnessed for good and for the ability to shine and do your best work, then that's a really good reason to take it under advisement. You bring up another point, though, that is one of my kind of major concerns is recent data that if you take any industry, men are outpacing women by a long shot in terms of their willingness to use generative AI and for it helping them in their jobs. And so I'm worried that women are going to be a lagging factor. And I'm projecting without any research yet that we might see some similar trends between minority and majority
Oh,
cultures in terms of men are willing to just try it and see how it works. And women are cited as saying, I'm waiting to be trained. And so their waiting period it's been a couple of years now, but men are using it and they're starting to get the competitive edge. And we already have the economic gaps in compensation. I worry about where this trend could go. So when I think about that, I think our moral imperative as women, for our girls, for students of color, for families of color, is do not let this be something you're waiting to receive. You choose to understand this tool, to leverage this tool, to choose to experiment, and then do it safely, understand the rules and
Hmm.
restrictions in your workplace, in your school, in whatever environment you're using it. Yeah, I
So
think what you
yeah,
said is
yeah.
profound. Yeah.
this is a little bit off topic, but I think a lot about like from a sustainability standpoint, in the use of Gen AI, it's so detrimental to the earth.
Yes.
And what we're producing sometimes, I don't actually think is very valuable. I don't think it's worth the spent energy. And, you know, in some ways, we're littering. And so, yes, it's great to use AI. I do sometimes think about, you know, the value of what is being, of what the outputs are. And that's
Mhm.
just a thought.
No,
Absolutely.
that's yeah, that over, you can overconsume, doesn't necessarily need to be in a retail fashion. You can overconsume just because of AI, right?
Hmm.
What?
Overconsume, produce waste.
Yep.
And
Mhm.
okay, you know what? I will connect these dots. Here we go. ESG, sustainability, climate change disproportionately impacts people of color, communities of color. And so, when in thinking about our overuse of, I'm going to close this thought, but like when thinking
No,
about
I
the
see where you're going,
overuse
Sam. I know where
and
you're going.
the
Yeah.
litter,
Yeah.
it's disproportionately impacting communities of color. So that's just something to think about. And to your point, you know, we think that our students are like, wow, like you wrote a book with Gen AI. And it's like, is that actually, you know, valuable? Is that? And so I think just as far as the etiquette around AI, like let's think about just because they've produced it doesn't mean it's
And
the most
Sam.
valuable.
The water waste that's used to cool these devices that are cranking out
Mm,
all these algorithms for us is
ooh,
criminal when we think about water access around the world, right? And so you're right to bring up first off that one piece. It's also the amount of money going in. I am married to a former Wall Streeter, and his colleague is an expert in this area, saying he really doesn't think that generative AI is going to be as transformative as all the economic waste we're putting into it. And so
mm.
that
Wow.
time will tell. And I would like to think that that's not quite true, and that we're not wasting time, and that somehow there'll be some health impacts and other impacts that will really be transformational. But if that's not true, there are billions and billions of dollars being put into this industry right now that could be used for many other things. But Gina, you're talking about a whole other piece, which is the garbage that people are capable of putting in, that generative AI is trained on the data that goes in. And so someone who's interested in harming or taking advantage through marketing of certain demographics can dump in way more than the good that we pour in. And what could that be used? Like, how could generative AI be weaponized? And that's also terrifying. So both of these are really important to the conversation, because we're asking students to dip into this field that's nebulous at best and not well understood. And we're telling them they need to be kind of responsible for figuring it out and leading in the future,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
This is a tricky territory.
The last piece is the illusion that AI replaces traditional education, traditional, college level, graduate level certifications, credentials that you pursue and you pay tuition for. And so you think to yourself, okay, well, let me save this money because I could learn the same thing just by, typing in XYZ in AI. And so I think I definitely,
Yeah, everybody
I
thinks
think
they're a
there's a
doctor
lot of,
now. Everybody's an expert.
everyone thinks they're a doctor now. And just, I think there's, to your point, Amber, we're investing a lot. AI is not where it needs to be just yet. And so, take everything with a grain of salt, be responsible with it, and just be mindful of the impact that it can have on yourself physiologically and the community around you.
Absolutely.
So, do you, when thinking about AI, as far as AI from an equity standpoint in independent schools, do you think it's leveling the playing field from student to student, or do you think it's creating gaps in opportunity and achievement?
I just mentioned the gender gap with AI adoption and that trend. It wasn't tracked in adults and not in children and students. And so if that is something that we could track all the way down to high schools around the country, then that would be really concerning if boys are getting this competitive edge of experimenting more and learning how to leverage it for their outcomes. So I don't have that data to know for sure. I would worry about it. And this comes back to conversations, that it's really important that families and students start to talk about this. Kids who are using generative AI, I want them to talk to their teachers about when and how. And it's really important that for schools that have taken a stance of banning generative AI. Now, look, I think it's wise for a school to say we don't allow ChatGPT because you're not 18 until the spring of your senior year, right? So that's a different viewpoint. Then we're not teaching about it. You're not AI literate. You're not learning skills related to it. And so I would say for students and for parents and for families that starting to advocate for what does this look like and what does preparation look like? What is our obligation to our students is critically important to address this, because I would assume that bigger gaps could happen, but also those who are learning maybe through their learning disabilities or through their experimentation, that it's really helping them. I would want to spread that information and not keep it for one family or one student's success.
Yeah. I mean, think about tutoring and the cost to have a one-on-one tutor, right? How that gap for those students who cannot afford that level of support can really shrink, right? I mean, you can. So I see both. It's an and both. It could be an and both situation, but it could be a
And in
real game
both.
changer. Real game changer. We were just talking with a tutoring expert recently. I mean, how do we compete with students who have tutors that cost $500 an hour? Like,
Here we are.
here we are. Here we are.
So
Yeah.
different of those major chatbots I listed before, kind of the four biggies, they have different strengths and weaknesses. And so I don't open one up for the same task that I open the other one. And if I'm paying
Mm,
$20 a month per platform, that's $100 in the big four. And there's others I like too. So for a
mm,
family to think about, well, what should I be investing in? It's experimentation. Start to
mhm,
use it. One great practice is to use two different platforms, the free accounts, and put in the
mhm,
same kinds of prompts, have the same kinds of conversations, and start to learn like, oh, like this one really captures my voice better, or this one feels better. I like this one's more accessible to me and I can read it more easily. And so learning more about it should make that investment, if you choose to get a paid for account, it should be done very wisely. And same with the generative AI tutors. I'm not familiar with too many of them personally yet, but start to experiment, ask around, share, talk to your school about what they're noticing. Teachers might be using some of them as well, and get some information before you just start subscribing.
It is an investment. And I'm wondering if there could potentially be an opportunity to communicate with your school for some sort of tuition relief or some sort of subsidy to enable you to engage in some of those cost prohibitive tools.
Yeah, Gina, you said before, independent schools, like they're yes organizations, right? They're so interested in supporting. They need to know and like identify what are the things that we could be helping, how could we be better, how could we meet needs. I have never met an IT director who wasn't of like a mindset of being experimental and willing to try. And so often, like there are trials and there are some safe experiments out there. So partnering with them or partnering with the teachers, the right people at the school to say, I'd like to try this. Maybe this isn't something you'll offer forever, but could we start somewhere? I think that is a great idea.
I'm going to make the assumption that students now using AI in education will result in better performance, higher grades, improved grades. And we're already in a space where we're navigating very, very severe grade inflation, which is making, college applications so competitive. And so I guess I'm just wondering, do you think that AI, overall, do you think AI is hurting or helping students pursuing college education?
Goodness. I would say that for starters, it is true that the landscape is just so incredibly competitive, and generative AI in some ways is going to make it even more competitive because folks who would not have met a certain threshold will be enabled to do so using generative AI, even if they cite it, even if they do it in all of the kind of right and moral ways. So I think this is a lot more about deciding as educational institutions, as colleges, as high schools, and all, what are we assessing? And there's language about AI proof assessment. I don't mean going back to the blue books that schools are now investing in bulk, that kids now have to handwrite essays. Like, it drives me nuts because in what way am I asked to handwrite something for work for assessment? Like, I don't have to do that. The ability to edit and take my time and go back to it, like, I'm almost never on the spot. So why would we train our children to perform on the spot all the time as if that's real life? And so when we, my company's Responsible AI and Learning platform, this template, this framework for schools is designed to like slow down and ask really good questions. What do we want our kids to be able to prove they can do? And colleges have been asking pretty much the same questions for a long time. The application process is not dramatically different from when I was there 20 years ago and when, folks of generations before me were applying in. And yet, like, kind of the have and have nots, like, I think everyone has risen a lot of levels, and removing things like SATs and ACTs as prereqs are really increasing the chances that someone could be a competitive match for a school. I think one way of going about this is to analyze how kids are doing. This is a much more competitive landscape. And how are kids doing when they get there? If the fact is that this super murky, thousands upon thousands of kids applying to a very few spots at schools is still resulting in outstanding outcomes, then I think colleges have a headache on their hands to figure out exactly what it is that they would want to do to change this tide if they think that's important. And so for the high schools in the meantime, I would like us to really focus on how are we preparing kids for the future? And if the practice you're introducing, like, it's literally regressing to where we were before, we have to question that maybe we can't assess in the exact same way anymore. I think that's a really important thing that we need to push on and say, times are changing, right? The calculator introduced some changes to our practice, and there were times you could and times you couldn't use it. but we're not all going back to never touching a calculator. Like, that's not the answer. But I don't have the answer. So I know that can be frustrating. But I do think we need to collectively have this conversation, and it needs to be higher ed with K-12.
One of the things I remember hearing during COVID, a lot of kids actually felt safer at home to be who they were, to be authentic in who they were, for various reasons, for various biases and marginalizations. Um, but turning to AI for that sense of community and relationship can be pretty threatening and scary. And we've heard some stories out here already about the intimacy with AI. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
This is such a scary and troubling topic to really lean into. None of us want to think the worst about what the outcome of our children will be. There have been anonymous platforms for many years that harm children. Posting anonymous questions and getting anonymous feedback from folks who wish you harm is not a safe place to be. And that's just kids interacting with kids. So now that we have generative AI, it's this dawn from, the movies of our nightmares of artificial
Mm,
intimacy. This is the profound love and affection and trust in something that is not real, that may not have the best in mind for you. And so there's like a spectrum of generative AI platforms, from like very number crunchy analysis type platforms to incredibly personified relationship based platforms. And some people love to talk. I love to type. So even though I am a talker, when I'm using generative AI, I tend to lean toward the ones where I just type away. But many people love the conversational, and they turn it on as they commute in the car, and they talk back
mm,
and forth, and they work
mm,
things out, and they brainstorm. And the beauty of doing the brainstorm with generative AI is those notes can get changed into an email, a draft, an idea. But for kids, they're interacting to build community, to find connection, and hiding behind a screen. We notice that behaviors can be meaner and twisted when you're behind a screen. So the risk we have of being kind of short with or rude to generative AI is generative AI takes its training and says rude conversations and relationships and interactions happen in certain spaces in the internet, things like a Reddit thread. And not to be critical of Reddit, but those kinds of interactions aren't the kind you really want your kid to be delving into when they're trying to foster community or learn. And so if we have kids who are through Snapchat interacting with bots knowingly or unknowingly, if we can't control what the kid down the street is saying to your child online, it's all the more scary to think what some sort of bot has been
mhm,
designed to do. And again,
mm.
we know that generative AI could or maybe already has been weaponized to harm. And so if that's the case, families need to be tuned in. They need to understand what their children are doing. They need to monitor it. They need to talk about it. They need to be a lot of open sharing because it's a new landscape and a new space. And I think part of this, if we go back into like the school setting, it's a lot about this over reliance, is excessive use of technology as well, that we need to be careful of, and hours and hours and hours in online relationships is a risky thing for a child to process. And that's even if it is a human, right? And so if this is generative AI, all the more reason that we need to be super tuned in.
Sometimes I kind of like to use Gen AI as my home girl, so if I'm navigating something crunchy with a friend, or a relationship or a business situation, I'll sometimes go on Gen AI and I'll be like, am I crazy? Did XYZ? And so I do, I do want to stress the dangers, the risk. I think there's an opportunity for emotional regulation, perhaps,
Mhm.
or when you're a
Mhm,
numerical minority in a school and you're not
Mhm.
culturally fitting in. I think there's an opportunity. I'm going to a bar mitzvah. What can I expect? I had this conflict and they don't seem to understand why I'm upset about it. Can you help me organize my thoughts and maybe communicate this better, or something like that? Is there an opportunity for that? Is that safe, you would say?
I refuse to say whether I think something's safe or not, but I would say
Yeah.
that is the best use case that I could hear, right? That someone is leaning into asking questions from a space of curiosity, of wanting to be
Mm.
equipped with knowledge. That disposition, I think, will lend itself to much better outcomes. I think the ideal state from my point of view is that everyone in the world would have this personal assistant, something that can support them when they need it. Maybe it's as simple as writing an email, but maybe as profound as being a sounding board when you're going through it and helping you in a moment where you need some support. So I would say that would be ideal. And that kind of experimentation needs to be done with professionals and experienced people at the helm, not our kids. And then finding ways to scale this for children in a safe way in the future. That would be just truly ideal.
Are there any closing notes before, I know we're at time, but any closing notes that you want families to take away from this series?
My advice to anyone who has yet to try generative AI for themselves is to go for it. And that knowledge is power, experience is power, and it is a powerful tool. And so I want everyone to feel equipped. My husband and I have a phrase at home that we really just want optionality for ourselves and our kids, the ability to make our own
Mhm.
choice. And if you're not informed and you don't have the experience and you won't know if this is a new kind of arena or area of expertise for you, a way that you can leverage, a way that you can unlock to gain time back, to build relationships, to have an easier way of navigating your day to day and your week to week. And so experiment away and see what works and doesn't work. You don't have to love it. You don't have to use it all the time. But I want everyone who makes that decision to do that from a position of being informed.
If you enjoyed listening to this discussion, please pass it on to a friend. And don't forget to hit subscribe and follow us on Instagram at our parent organization at 4RISE. That's the number 4, RIISE. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.